3,000 too many. In 3 weeks, Israel killed 3,600 Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip, more than all the children killed in all conflict areas in a year. Of the 8,800 Palestinians killed so far, more than 70% are children and women. Nearly all are civilians.
Is there anyone here, anyone with a shred of humanity and decency, that thinks there is any justification for that? Anyone here that believes these numbers are possible if Israel was not targeting civilians, or at the very least, conducting indiscriminate attacks? The rules of international law came in response to tragedies we failed to prevent. We remember the names of these tragedies. They are the names of towns, cities, provinces, forever etched in our collective memory as open wounds, as stains on humanity's conscience, as reminders of what happens when the worst occurs and the many remain silent. In that list, Gaza's name is in bold. It appears several times for the decades of military occupation, for 16 years of blockade, for 5 wars, and now more than ever, for 3 weeks where the Gaza Strip has been besieged and bombed with no regard for the life of 2.3 million Palestinians who live there. The international community has failed those who were killed. It is failing the besieged, the wounded, the sick, the displaced. But thousands of lives hang in the balance. They can still be saved. There is no way to describe what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip as anything else than war crimes. Let me reformulate. There is no way to describe what is happening as anything less than war crimes. If you recognize these acts are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, these are crimes against humanity. If you recognize they are committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national group, then they are genocide. These are the choices: genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Which one does any country here wants to try and justify? Is there any country still ready to evoke unconditional support for Israel while it is committing these atrocities, while it is occupying, colonizing, besieging, killing, and maiming? As member states of the United Nations, you pledged unconditional support to the UN Charter, to the rule of international law. Every nation has to choose where its loyalty lies. What is clear is that support for Israel in this war is incompatible with that pledge, with your obligation to uphold international law. International law, as a leading humanitarian NGO puts it, the humanitarian rule book has been thrown out, and polite pleas from politicians to minimize civilian fatalities are naive at best, and at worst seem blind to the unimaginable horrors already taking place in Gaza. International law is the standard against which all our actions are measured. Condoning double standards can only undermine and jeopardize the credibility and rule of international law. No exceptionalism for Israel, and no exception for Palestine and the Palestinian people. You know how what is happening in Palestine now is possible? One wonders, looking at these images, how is this possible? Not for one day, not for two, for days and weeks now. Live on TV screens being broadcasted around the world, massacres taking place. You know how it is possible? Read the Rome Statute. It has all the answers. It states, determined to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes, and thus contribute to the prevention of such crimes. Impunity leads to recurrence of crimes. 75 years, not a single Israeli leader or commander or soldier has been held accountable for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. Not one. We joined the ICC almost 10 years ago and still await for justice to be delivered. There were countries to oppose us joining the ICC. There were countries to oppose the General Assembly seizing the International Court of Justice. How can they explain why Israel can never be held accountable in any form or any forum? This is not what history taught us. It taught us that our best chance against horrors is for the law to be upheld, for justice to be ensured, regardless of the identity of their victims and regardless of the identity of the perpetrators. That there is no justification whatsoever for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. None. The Israeli permanent representative stood in the Security Council and placed a yellow star on his jacket, evoking the Holocaust, while at the same time justifying the bombings that are killing Palestinian civilians by the thousands, children by the thousands. No one can instrumentalize the Holocaust to justify atrocities. No one. We honor the victims of the Holocaust and all victims by never justifying the killing of innocent civilians, by upholding international law for all. The Holocaust was one of the worst horrors humanity ever witnessed, and with other horrors led us to elaborate the very rules that are being breached today. The Charter, the Geneva Convention, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. It led us to adopt the Rome Statute 50 years too late and build a court with a universal calling, not for one group against another, but for all humanity. Are we not part of that human family? Are Palestinian civilian lives less sacred? Does anyone here agree with Israel that we are subhumans? During each statement delivered here, every 5 minutes, a Palestinian child is killed. When we say every minute counts, we mean it. It's the difference between life and death for hundreds of people, for thousands of people. Palestinian families have lost 10, 20, 30, 40 of their relatives, killed en masse, several generations at a time. Some have disappeared from the face of the earth. You have families. You have grandparents and parents and siblings and children and grandchildren. Think of them. And then think of a single Palestinian family that have lost all of them, or of the child that survived all of the rest of his family and who has to go through life with that reality. Hundreds of Palestinian families have lost more than 10 members of their family. Nothing can justify this war going on for a single minute. Nothing. We have 2,000 Palestinians under the rubble. We can't reach them. Can't save those who could still be saved, can't bury those who were killed. A mother said she could still hear her child under the rubble. She will never know if he could have been saved or not. She will never know. Never again means never standing idly by while atrocities are committed. It means never justifying such atrocities under any pretense or pretext. It means standing up to them and standing up for those enduring them. The General Assembly adopted a resolution grounded in morality and legality, calling for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, for upholding international humanitarian law and the protection of all civilians, for humanitarian access and aid to the Palestinian people throughout the Gaza Strip, for release of civilians held captive, for stopping and reversing forced transfer of population, for accountability, and for peace. We appreciate all those who voted in favor of that resolution and call on them to spare no effort to ensure its implementation. And we call on those who did not vote in favor of this resolution to review their untenable position. We appreciate every effort to get humanitarian aid in. We appreciate every effort to allow to save lives. But the only way for us to address this catastrophic situation underway is to stop the assault immediately. We call on the prosecutor who made an important visit to the region in the midst of this unfolding tragedy to uphold his mandate, and all states to help ensure accountability. We need your unconditional support to civilians, including children, to the humanitarian personnel performing in impossible conditions. 67 of UNRWA staff have been killed. Many doctors, many rescue teams have been bombarded. Many hospitals, many schools are under the bombs. There's no safe haven, no safe place in Gaza. People are asked to go south, and the south is under the bombs. 40% of those killed were killed in the south. Don't believe the lies. There is nothing called an evacuation order to protect civilians. Israel has admitted in this memo of the Ministry of Intelligence that the goal was the forced displacement of people outside of the Gaza Strip, outside of Palestine. The same goal pursued over 75 years. We have 75 years of experience to know Israeli goals. It is not to protect our civilians. It has never been to protect our civilians. It has always been to dispossess and displace our people. This is an unlawful order. Nobody should justify it. The protection follows the civilians. It's not the civilians who run after protection. They should be protected wherever they are. This order is a death sentence for many who cannot leave where they are. There is no shelters, no infrastructure to receive them. There is not a single safe place in Gaza. We need your unconditional support to the wounded and the sick, to the law, to humanity, to a reality where no Palestinians are killed and no Israelis are killed, where our rights are no longer denied, where families are reunited in life, not death, where we are all able to live in peace and security. Only one path can lead us there. No one should obstruct it. All should help us on it. It is the one we identified when we joined the ICC with 3 simple words: justice, not vengeance. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/78L6 entitled Report of the International Criminal Court. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegation listed on the L document, the foreign countries have also become co-sponsors of A/78/L6. Albania, Andorra, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Barbados, Belgium, Belize, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Botswana, Bulgaria, Cabo Verde, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Estonia, Fiji, Finland, France, Gambia, Georgia, Germany, Ghana, Greece, Guatemala, Honduras, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Madagascar, Malawi, Malta, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Montenegro, New Zealand, Nigeria, North Macedonia, Norway, Paraguay, Peru, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Romania, Samoa, San Marino, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, Ukraine, United Kingdom, United Republic of Tanzania, and Uruguay. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/78/L6, please signify by pressing the microphone button. I see Gabon, if the delegation of Gabon turn off the microphone button and if there's any other change. And I see Congo. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/78/L6, please signify. Those against? Abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/78/L6 entitled Report of the International Criminal Court. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
Ready? The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 115. Against, 6. Abstentions, 31. Draft resolution A/78/L6 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Brazil.
Mr. President, as I mentioned during the debate, the difficulty to achieve consensus for the first time in this annual resolution highlights the need for us to reflect on how we may overcome the current pressing challenges faced by the International Criminal Court, rather than simply disregarding them. And this is why Brazil has chosen to abstain. Achieving universal adherence, addressing concerns related to partiality, selectivity, and double standards, ensuring effective state cooperation, fostering coherence within the international legal system, and rectifying geographical imbalances within the ICC's institutional structure are some of these critical challenges. It is essential that the ICC conducts a thorough self-assessment of its current activities as outlined in its annual report, addressing these and other concerns to further its noble mission of ending the impunity for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole. In closing, Mr. President, allow me to reiterate Brazil's unwavering commitment to international law and international justice as underscored in my remarks during this debate. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished delegate of Brazil, and I now invite the distinguished delegate of Israel to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Israel was an early advocate for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. However, Israel has decided to abstain for the reason it has expressed in previous years when it disassociated itself from this resolution. As a democratic state based on the rule of law, and as the nation of the state of the Jewish people, we remain committed to ensuring that the perpetrators of mass atrocities that deeply shocked and conscious of humanity are held accountable. In that context, Israel has already stated that it has launched a national investigation in relation to the barbaric and ongoing crimes committed by Hamas against Israeli children, women, and men in a murderous terror attack that started on October 7th, 2023, and will seek to hold those responsible to account. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Israel for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my delegation chose to join the states that voted against the draft resolution and the states that clearly expressed how dismayed they are from the unprecedented politicization of the performance of the ICC. My country was among the states that effectively participated in the Rome Conference in 1998 and contributed in an important manner in the drafting of the statute of the court. We were among the first states to sign the statute of the court. However, the stumbling performance and the selective approach by the ICC since it was established was the reason for not signing the statute, despite the fact that the work of the committee was simultaneously aligned with some of the most heinous and serious crimes committed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and occupied Palestine. The record of the court was full of failures of betraying the victims of the Iraq and the Afghanistan invasions, as well as the violations by Israel, the victims of Abu Ghraib, among others. Today, 25 years after the adoption of the statute of the court, we became confident that we were right to take that position against the court and not to ratify its statute. Mr. President, it is truly regrettable for us to see the fact that the court has been taken hostage by directives from Western states, including the United States that have ratified the statute, and to draft decisions and legislations to obstruct the work of the court. We all remember the ASDA, the Act to Protect the servicemen of the United States, known as the Lehigh Service Law. Have these states rediscovered the court, or along with their Western allies decided to redefine the court by turning it into a tool to bring pressure to bear and to bring coercive diplomacy in the face of certain states? These states are, by coincidence, African states. What a coincidence. Most of the countries that were targeted were African states, as if those gross violations are a trademark of African leaders. This has happened despite the fact that history taught us otherwise. History taught us that the most heinous crimes committed in Africa were perpetrated by the West and continues to perpetrate it against Africa and the peaceful people of Africa. Things did not stop there. The court has turned recently, or the speaker says, started issuing subpoenas on demand, international subpoenas on demand. And this is a new service. These are new customer services. And even if these subpoenas were to face senior officials from non-member states, this is against the rules of international law on sovereignty, personal and otherwise, agreed upon by customary law and confirmed by the decisions of the International Court of Justice. In full view of the world and on TV screens, we witness an act of genocide that continues against a whole people in Gaza. Where is the criminal court while all of this is taking place? The court decided to remain silent or only to make declarations. The court decided to stand idly by while children are killed, where hospitals are targeted, and even those who are already dead are targeted. This is exactly the position that was clearly understood due to the court's position towards Palestine. As for encouraging member states to adhere to the court, it would be tantamount to being asked to be partners to the crime and to remain silent while these crimes are committed. Most of the leaders and the Israeli war criminals who clearly declare that they are determined to annihilate civilians, to destroy Gaza, and to deal with the Gaza people as human animals, all of those, I say, have citizenships of member states in the court. All of those, I repeat, have citizenships of countries in the court in addition to their own. And this is against the court's statute in rule number 12. So why won't these states who claim to be protecting international justice, why don't they submit them to the court? Why doesn't this apply to ISIS? Because most of the ISIS members are citizens of these states. My answer is because this does not serve the interests of these states that are partners in the crimes committed by the Israeli occupation and those of ISIS. We do not exaggerate when we say that silence by the court towards the crimes in Gaza makes the court a partner in the crime. And it is a partner because it did not move. It was a partner when it divided the Sudan, in destroying Libya, and in failing Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and Afghanistan. In conclusion, sir, what I said before are not claims. Those are facts confirmed by history. And therefore, talking about the universality of international criminal law, which the court is supposed to be representing, or that is what it was supposed to have represented, is something that includes an exaggeration. We might be better off admitting that the selective performance and the systematic targeting that now guide the work of the court has ridden the concept of international justice from credibility, and therefore we are now with the justice of the victors, of those who took revenge, and those who financed. Thank you.
May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 74?
Israel is asking for the floor.
The Chair recognizes the distinguished delegation of Israel.
Thank you, Chair. We regret that once again the Palestinian delegate has chosen to exploit this esteemed platform and exhaust its valuable time.
You ask.
Would the delegate of Israel please indicate whether the statement he is in the process of making constitutes a right of reply?
We want to have a right of reply, Mr. President.
The exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now call on the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. We regret that once again, the Palestinian delegate has chosen to exploit this esteemed platform and exhaust its valuable time by sharing misleading information and inflate numbers, seemingly running out of valid legal arguments. We should all remember, there is no law without facts, and the facts are very clear. Hamas, the genocidal terrorist organization, started this war, and Israel has the legal and the moral right to protect its citizens, period. Hamas is the ruler of Gaza Strip. Hamas is behind this attack, and it will be held accountable for the ramifications of its actions, period. In this asymmetric lawfare, everything is asymmetric. There is one side, a democratic state, which abides by the international law and does everything within its power to minimize civilian casualties. And on the other side, there is a genocidal terror organization which blatantly ignores and violates international law time and again, and strives to maximize the civilian casualties on the Israeli side as well as on the Palestinian side. If the Palestinian delegate and their supporters' concerns are genuinely for the well-being of Palestinians in Gaza, we suggest they address Hamas, which hides in the tunnels under hospitals and whose actions and use of civilians as human shields significantly impacts the situation on the ground. The right thing to do is to condemn Hamas. If they won't condemn Hamas, as they haven't been refusing to do since the massacre on October 7th, perhaps it would be better if this forum would focus on developing the international law rather than being influenced by those who wish to spread false information and political agendas. Thank you, Mr. President.
May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 74? It is so decided. Members are reminded that the 43rd plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session will be held immediately after the adjournment of this meeting. The meeting is adjourned. The 43rd plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. Oh, it's empty. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, to resume the debate on the item pursuant to the decision taken at the 40th plenary meeting on 27th October 2023. Can I encourage delegates to, if you need to consult, can you do so outside the room so that we can hear the delegates who will make presentations this afternoon? I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to salute you using the greetings of Islam, the religion of peace and mercy. Peace be upon you, so is God's and His blessings. Allow me to begin by extending our deep respect and gratitude to the 121 states that honorably stated their position last Friday and decided not to stand idly by while genocide and collective punishment were visited upon our defenseless civilian Palestinian brothers. Please do not forget that on the same day when you decided to stand by what you deemed as right and made your positions known, challenged criminality, atrocities, and heinous crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces, they declared the start of their ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. They did not stop there. They doubled their strikes and bloodthirsty violence against innocent civilians who were mostly women and children who committed no sin to deserve this fate. Does the world still believe that what has been unfolding is in self-defense? Are there among you those who continue to remain indifferent in the face of an unfolding genocide playing live daily before your very eyes? Do you accept that an occupation entity unilaterally roughshod over the rules and principles of the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law? I just wonder how audacious are those who turn a blind eye to atrocities and fail to condemn them. You dragged this organization to an abyss the likes of which we have never seen before because of your double standards and selectivity in applying the law. Mr. President, Kuwait's position vis-à-vis the crimes committed before our own eyes is based on three basic principles. First, an immediate ceasefire. Second, opening border crossings and providing urgent access for relief humanitarian assistance supplies. Third, rejecting any attempt to initiate or initiative to forcefully displace the Palestinian people to areas outside their occupied territories. On the application of law, I would review with you the actions of the coward occupation forces violating the interests of civilians. And I say coward because this is against because of the actions of the Israeli forces who have no sin other than they were created Palestinians. We see daily violations of the principles of international law, international humanitarian law, in addition to many decisions and resolutions adopted by the Security Council and the General Assembly, the countless decisions. So I would like to review with you the violations against the civilians. Some of the most difficult scenes that we are seeing daily is killing innocent children, young children who only hope to go to schools to play with each other. They have committed no crime whatsoever. And I would like to draw your attention here to the statements declared made by Save the Children 2 days ago, to the effect that the number of children killed in Gaza in the past 3 weeks alone exceeded the annual number of children killed all over conflict zones in the world since 2019. Over 3,257 children have been killed since October 7. Let's review together some of the resolutions by the Security Council that are daily violated by the occupying authorities for the past 25 days. First, Security Council Resolutions 1261 of 1999. It was the first resolution of its kind to be tabled before the Security Council, condemning targeting children in armed conflict, forcibly displacing them, attacking targets protected under international law, including in areas in which children are present in large numbers. In addition to guaranteeing access by humanitarian officers and providing humanitarian assistance
in a safe and complete manner without any obstruction to children affected by armed conflicts. The resolution also stresses the importance of the safety, freedom of movement, and security of UN staff and associated staff, and stressing the responsibility by all states to put an end to impunity and to their commitment to bring those responsible for the gross violations of the 1949 conventions to justice. Second, Security Council Resolution 1998 of 2011. This resolution condemns attacks against schools and hospitals and obstructing access to humanitarian assistance by parties to armed conflicts and other violations of international law against children in cases of international conflict. Third, Security Council Resolution 2286 of 2016, which condemns acts of violence, strikes, and threats against those who've been injured, who are sick, medical crews, and those who provide humanitarian assistance, who are exclusively undertaking medical tasks and against their means of transport and equipment, as well as against hospitals and other medical facilities. Fourth, Security Council Resolution 2347 of 2017 that condemns the destruction of cultural heritage represented in destroying religious sites in armed conflicts. Fifth, Security Council Resolution 2417 of 2018, which calls upon all parties to armed conflicts to commit to international humanitarian law, including the basic stuff and services that are indispensable for the sustained livelihoods of civilians, and to respect those who work in providing humanitarian assistance and other foodstuffs for relief purposes. Sixth, Security Council Resolution 2475 of 2019. The resolution urges all parties to conflicts to undertake measures according to international law and to commit to protecting civilians, including persons with disabilities, to prevent violence and acts of aggression committed against civilians in cases of armed conflict. Seventh, Security Council Resolution 2573 of 2021, which condemns attacks in cases of armed conflicts against civilians or civilian targets, and also arbitrary strikes or disproportionate strikes that lead to depriving civilians from the stuff that they definitely need to remain alive. Considering such acts and violations, gross violations of international humanitarian law, and calls upon all parties to armed conflicts to ceasefire, to exercise ceasefire against civilians. Please forgive me for having spoken at length. However, I think that we are at a stage where we have to start talking about all Israeli violations in all of our meetings. The misinformation campaigns by the occupation authorities require that we respond with unrefutable facts. It has become clear that when the word of what's right and justice pains them, and the fact that the people of the world stood besides the Palestinians is something that terrorizes them. Therefore, we stress the need for the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions on the protection of civilians, where such resolutions include uncontroversial languages, and therefore it's illogical for us not to implement them today. It's as if those who drafted these resolutions would know the criminal acts that will pursue in the future, and such resolutions seem as if they were custom-made to respond to the gross violations perpetrated by the occupation forces. Mr. President, what the Secretary General said pained them when he said that what happened in Gaza on the 7th of October was not born out of a vacuum. So they started attacking him, asking him to resign, and they declared they declared that he's not welcome to enter to their occupied entity. I would like to tell you, Mr. Guterres, you are the moral compass of this organization. We have only listened to arguments that highlight what is right, no matter how bitter the facts were. You should be welcome to any place on earth, any place that does not fear the words of rights, justice, and honesty. This only confirms what we already know. That is, this occupying power does not know what honesty is, what right is, and only promotes empty words and fabrications. The times has come, and we will not repeat what we have said over the last 56 years. The violation, killing, and violence perpetrated by the occupier has no place in our world today. Our only way forward would be the achievement of a full and comprehensive peace by the implementation of resolutions adopted in international contexts and the agreement to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 for the establishment of the State of Palestine, with Jerusalem as its capital on the lines of June 4th of 1967. We are all for the above. Therefore, we are not going to go back to where we were, to square one. The time has already passed. This is not because we refuse to address the situation. The world knows that the state of Palestine did not reject political negotiations. However, ignoring international legitimacies according to the interests and to the changes in views of those who are in command on the other side is something that we will not accept, and we will not ignore. We are states, and we have our own influence. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you the following: you tried everything. I would like to say to the occupying power, you were treacherous, you fought, you struck, you killed, you forced populations out, you displaced, you detained, and you imprisoned. You burnt everything before you. You only have one choice, which is the only choice that would rid us from this circle of violence that you have imposed for the past 56 years, which is to end occupation and to leave the Palestinian occupied territories. Our heart is broken. Our blood is boiling. Get out of our land. Leave our land. We don't regret your departure. In conclusion, our Palestinian brothers, you are free. You are the people of steadfastness and of struggle. We take pride in you, in your steadfastness and your courage. That is unprecedented. We will make every effort to show that you are in the right, and we will spare no effort to stand by your side. You are an inspiration. You have been the symbol of dignity, and I hope that you would be protected and peace be upon you, my distinguished delegates.
أشكر المندوب الدائم لدولة
I thank the permanent representative of the state of Kuwait, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
President, distinguished colleagues, the events of the last few weeks in the area of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have left probably no one on this earth indifferent. All of our hearts ache as we look at the heart-rending stories of human suffering. And the parties are shifting blame for the suffering from one to the next, while the civilians in Israel and Palestine continue to perish. Our mission receives tens of messages every day from Israeli citizens, Palestinians, and the diaspora. These people write to us about their loved ones in the conflict zone, urging us to do something, anything, to put an end to the violence. First and foremost, they are calling for a ceasefire, for hostages to be released. They're calling for the necessary humanitarian assistance to be delivered. These are thousands of horrendous individual stories, thousands of lives. I'd like to use the opportunity afforded by this rostrum to assure all those who have messaged us, who have contacted us, to assure them that we hear your pleas and we're doing everything within our power so that the international community can take steps to resolve this most acute crisis. We'd like to stress yet again that the violence visited upon civilians, Israeli civilians, since the start of October has no justification. We categorically repudiate and condemn them, all terrorist acts. We extend our condolences to all those who lost loved ones in Israel, Palestine, and in other countries. We demand the release of all persons held captive. Unfortunately, this tragedy didn't appear out of thin air. The protracted Israeli-Palestinian conflict was and remains at the epicenter of all Middle Eastern upheavals. For over 70 years, the Palestinian issue has remained unresolved, and it has prompted regional and international divergences of opinion. It's been exploited as an ideological motive by terrorist and extremist organizations in different parts of the world. What's more is, the fact that the issue is unresolved has resulted in untold suffering on the part of the Palestinian people, the Israeli people, Arab states, and all of the many Palestinian diasporas living therein, including refugees who have been forced to remain in camps for decades and decades. This state of play has been exacerbated over the last few years because Washington has acted alone, separately from our collective efforts, from agreed efforts. It's acted alone, imposing on Israel's Arab neighbors an economic peace without settling the Palestinian issue. We've reached a situation whereby there are now individual unilateral initiatives which not only ignore but actually undermine the international legal basis for the settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict endorsed by the UN and enshrined in UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. The US has attempted to turn a blind eye to the ongoing construction of Israeli settlements on the occupied territory. It's recognized Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights. And what we've now seen is the Americans calling for an end to the settler violence being foisted upon Palestinians in the West Bank. As a result, Palestinians who see no way out, and we see a conflict that's unprecedented in terms of its scope and risks spilling over to the entire Middle East. Over all these years, we've been warning about the fact that this course has no prospects. It's dangerous and can result in tragic consequences. This new outbreak of violence proves what we've said many times before. A normalization of Israel's relations with Arab states, although of course that would be positive, cannot occur at the expense of the Palestinians. It cannot result in a lasting stabilization of the situation unless we resolve a key issue in the Middle East, that is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This approach, as we saw for ourselves when on the 27th of October, here in this chamber, we adopted the Jordanian resolution. This approach is supported by the leadership of all Arab, Muslim, and many other states. It's a paradox that on the one part, the entire international community has recognized that Israel's activities in these occupied Palestinian territory are illegal because they're at odds with UN Security Council resolutions and the provisions of international law. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, our Western colleagues in their statements prefer to simply forget that this unprecedented escalation on the ground is also a consequence of the settlement policy of West Jerusalem, as well as the systematic restrictions West Jerusalem has placed on the Palestinians' ability to freely visit their holy sites. We're delighted that Antonio Guterres did not shy away from flagging this, speaking during Security Council deliberations on the Middle East on the 24th of October. He noted that the current uptick in violence did not happen in a vacuum. As a result, he was immediately subjected to irate and undeserved criticism on the part of Israel, which preferred to see history starting from a blank page, to see history begin on the 7th of October 2023. Colleagues, we'll all have to return to the root causes of the conflict. We'll have to put the Israeli-Palestinian settlement process on an agreed track. However, right now we need to immediately cease fire and put an end to the bloodshed. This should be obvious to all, you'd think. Unfortunately, our Western colleagues at the Security Council are continuing to torpedo any efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground. They continue to block the Security Council's attempt to urgently take measures to immediately normalize the situation, first and foremost to enact a ceasefire. This is what common sense dictates. What's more is, it's what humanitarian organizations in Gaza are calling for. Clearly, the fully fledged ground operation Israel has begun in Gaza can turn not just into a tragedy for 2 million Gazans, it can also trigger a regional conflagration. You'd think that everyone understands just how dangerous this scenario is, and yet it's only Washington which won't listen, which hypocritically is trying to pursue its own regional agenda, politicizing UN Security Council draft resolutions. Pass them, but we did not allow it to pass, nor did China. Our US colleagues are trying not just to divert attention from the failures of their policy to shift blame when it is itself at fault. They are accusing Iran, Hezbollah, and Gazans of all of the world's ills. They're also trying to legitimize all this, legitimize the ground operation through the Security Council. We remember the no-fly zone in Libya in 2019, when our Western colleagues had no trouble interpreting UN Security Council Resolution 1973 to their own benefit, waging an aggression on Libya. The UN Security Council does not have the right to grant this kind of carte blanche. President, I'd like to highlight that when we condemn the killing of Israeli civilians and foreigners in Israel, when we do that, we still cannot turn a blind eye to what Western Jerusalem is doing. They're committing flagrant violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods are being razed to the ground. According to information, we have over 8,500 people have been killed in the enclave. Most of them are women, children, and the elderly. Indiscriminate airstrikes have taken over 3,000 lives. Young Gazans are lying under the rubble. Over 2,000 of them. Half of them are children. As a result of the latest strike on the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, over 400 people died. The number of losses amongst UN personnel is staggering. 64 people have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. The number of IDPs in the Gaza Strip stands at 1.6 million people. As a result of the bombing of the Strip, 9 hospitals are completely out of commission. The rest of the hospitals are facing acute shortages of medicines. Over 100 people, including over 300 people, including many of them children, have also perished in the West Bank. Against this backdrop, Israeli officials are making insulting pronouncements regarding all Palestinians, talking about the collective responsibility of an entire people, responsibility for the actions of Hamas. Israel's orders to evacuate over 1 million people are pronouncements that do not hold water. Also, the total blockade imposed by Israel on the Strip is unacceptable. It's cut off from the rest of the world. This blockade has provoked panic amongst these frightened people who've lost all hope. It's undermined the work of medical and emergency staff and will inevitably result in greater civilian casualties. You cannot vanquish terrorism using these means. We call on the parties to the conflict to immediately put an end to the bloodshed, to give mediators an opportunity to seek a diplomatic solution, including the swift release of hostages. We will have to go down this path sooner or later. The question is how many innocent people will die until the decision is taken to do so. President, colleagues, we cannot but mention the hypocrisy of the US and their allies. They, in other completely different situations, are issuing appeals for the respect to humanitarian law, establishing investigations, committees, imposing sanctions on those who are actually genuinely only resorting to force as a last resort to put an end to years of violence. And yet today we're witnessing horrific destruction in Gaza, greater than all the West criticizes in other regions, greater by many orders of magnitude. We're seeing strikes on humanitarian objects, including hospitals, thousands of children dying, horrific suffering on the part of civilians under conditions of a total blockade, and yet the West remains silent. The only thing they can muster is continued pronouncements about Israel's supposed right to self-defense, although as an occupying power, it does not have that power, as confirmed by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice handed down in the year 2004. We hope that these blatant double standards are obvious to our colleagues in the Global South. As for Israel's security, and we recognize its right to ensure its security, this security can only be fully guaranteed if we resolve the Palestinian issue on the basis of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We do not deny Israel the right to fight terrorism, but fight the terrorists. Don't fight civilians. Otherwise, you yourselves are taking the side of evil. You are deploying the same methods evil deploys. The Jewish people suffered persecution for many centuries, and the Jewish people should know better than anyone that the suffering of ordinary people, innocent lives lost in the name of blind retribution, will neither restore justice nor bring the dead back to life nor console their families. Islam, Christianity, Judaism are united in recognizing the value of human life, which belongs to God. God giveth, and only God is entitled to take it away. In these very testing times, the Russian Federation is taking active measures to immediately resolve the crisis. We are very much in favor of an ongoing negotiation process at an endorsed UN forum, following which we should establish a sovereign Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel. On this note, we'd like to commend the efforts of the Arab group, spearheaded by Jordan. They authored the UNGA resolution adopted on the 27th of October. That resolution called for urgent measures to put an end to the violence, to the military hostilities, to immediately release hostages, to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to disallow the conflict spilling over into the rest of the region. The Russian Federation wholeheartedly supported this Arab peace initiative. In fact, we are one of the co-sponsors. We urge all states to implement it. President, we stand convinced that in addition to resolving this new uptick in violence, we must put paid to this upsurge in violence, but also come up with a strategy of collective action to achieve the political solution of this conflict. This is something that the Middle Eastern Quartet, which is made up of Russia, the US, the EU, and the UN, was working on, but it has been blocked by Washington. On the agenda, we have a joint mediation mechanism with a key role for regional states, and we've seen positive trends of late in the Middle East, the Saudi-Iranian normalization, the reintegration of Syria into the League of Arab States. All of this proves that countries in the region, when they take the situation into their hands without being subjected to external pressure, they can progress a great deal towards a stabilization in the Middle East. Under the current circumstances, the Russian Federation is in favor of constructive exchanges with all parties involved. We're ready to continue contributing to the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including at this stage, once we neutralize the current crisis. First and foremost, we need to put an end to the violence, unless we want to put away the idea of resolving this conflict one day. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to this distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Nepal is grieving under deep anguish in the death of 10 Nepali nationals in southern Israel when it came under sudden attack on 7 October 2023. The government of Nepal has strongly condemned the terrorist attack on Israel. With equal gravity, we are against the indiscriminate use of force against civilians by both parties involved in the conflict, including the strike at the hospital in Gaza that killed hundreds of people, including children, women, elderly, medical personnel, and patients. We are deeply disturbed by the rising number of deaths of civilians, destruction of properties, and the resulting humanitarian crisis. Nothing can justify inflicting sufferings on and killings of innocent people, whether Palestinians or Israelis. Nepal calls for an immediate de-escalation and avoidance of indiscriminate use of force to prevent civilian casualties, stop the destruction of public and private properties, and provide immediate, unrestricted, and adequate humanitarian assistance to the desperate civilians in Gaza. The United Nations has the responsibility to prevent humanitarian catastrophe and breach of peace. We, the member states, must demonstrate courage to utilize the platform of the United Nations to bring both sides to the negotiating table to find a just, peaceful, amicable, and lasting political solution to the problem. To this end, Nepal supports the efforts made by the Secretary General to de-escalate war, open and avail unrestricted humanitarian relief. We are deeply concerned about our missing student, Mr. Bipin Joshi, and are desperately waiting for the information on his whereabouts. Nepal is in favor of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security within recognized international borders based on international law and the relevant UN resolutions. This is the only way forward for a just, lasting, and peaceful solution to the question of Israel-Palestine conflict. Peace is only possible when both sides respect each other's existence and dignity. Hatred never incubates peace. Nepal calls upon both sides to exercise maximum restraint and resort to dialogue to find a solution where both Israelis and Palestinians live in peace. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, it was the great Mahatma who told us that an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. Is that what we seek to achieve, distinguished delegates? He didn't stop there. He asked us the question, what difference does it make to the dead, the injured, the orphans, and the homeless, whether the mad destruction is wrought under the name of totalitarianism or the holy name of liberty or democracy? That's the question he asked. Mr. President, liberty and democracy, the Mahatma says, becomes unholy when our hands are dyed red with innocent blood. In the context of today, that's perhaps very. Mr. President, victory attained by violence
is tantamount to a defeat, for it is momentary. The weak, they say, can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. Sri Lanka therefore offers these words of gentle persuasion to our fellow beings who are at war, a war that neither will win, but will surely leave a loser, and that is humanity. Is that the legacy, I ask, we desire to leave our future generations? Is this the agenda we intend to prosecute for peace? Do we really believe we can achieve the SDGs in such a hostile environment? Mr. President, it was only in the latter half of last September, that our leaders met in this august assembly, in this very hall, to lay the foundation for a better world. We deliberated upon what remedial measures should be taken, as the euphemism suggested, to get back into the game that did not look promising at halftime. We comforted ourselves in the thought that many games are won in the second half. Dreams, isn't it? It was only on that optimistic note that we resolved to take upon the challenge of working towards those lofty goals. We discussed the vital role of financing for development. We discussed the climate catastrophe confronting the planet. We adopted 3 declarations on the main topics on health concerning our countries. Our ministers adopted the scope and elements of what would be the summit of the future. However, the supreme irony is that in contrast, we are compelled to witness death and destruction. Violent attacks on civilians, kidnappings and hostage-taking, and retaliatory measures on civilian life and property, and the threat of a wider conflict. Mr. President, all this predictably will ensure the game will be lost at full time if the hostilities and military misadventures we witness in Palestine and Israel today does not stop now. As the PGA was pleased to observe in his opening statement of this emergency special session, the war drums must stop beating. Mr. President, Sri Lanka is therefore deeply concerned by the ongoing escalation of violence and military action in Gaza, which is causing deaths and injuries to many innocent civilians and children, resulting in a grave humanitarian situation. The legitimate security concerns of both Israeli and Palestinian people have to be recognized. We observe that indiscriminate actions that cause civilian casualties will only make the realization of an enduring peace a distant reality. Sri Lanka supports diplomatic efforts to find a lasting solution to the conflict and humbly requests both parties to engage in a dialogue to achieve a durable peace. Mr. President, since the adoption of the resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations last Friday by this Assembly, the situation in Gaza has worsened manifold. Death and destruction continue unabated. According to UNRWA, over 1 million people have been displaced. The UNICEF has reported that out of the total dead, 3,450 are children, innocent children. The United Nations last Sunday held a memorial for 59 UNRWA staff killed in Gaza. Millions are suffering without basic essentials and face a lifetime of trauma. I'm asking the question, will such trauma solve the problems of the Middle East? So we reiterate our call to keep open a humanitarian corridor to provide urgent humanitarian assistance to the civilians in Gaza, and are committed to supporting the efforts and activities of the United Nations Secretary General in his endeavor to mitigate the suffering of the people, the loss and damage to life and property, and to bring about a ceasefire. Mr. President, Sri Lanka calls for the free movement of essential items and humanitarian aid, including food, fuel, medicine, and electricity and water supply to Gaza. We call on all sides to immediately halt violence and take steps to prevent further civilian casualties. We also call upon the international community to redouble their efforts and support the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The UNRWA is playing a commendable and courageous role, I must say, in helping a vulnerable population under extremely challenging circumstances. Mr. President, in the light of the ongoing hostilities, it is therefore important, my delegation says, to address the situation with empathy, with understanding, and a commitment to finding a peaceful resolution. We therefore have a plea to the leaders and the peoples of Israel and Palestine. We acknowledge, of course, the deep pain, the loss, suffering that both sides have experienced as a result of the ongoing hostilities. We urge you to prioritize the well-being and security of all individuals involved and to work towards a lasting peace that ensures the safety, dignity, and the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. We understand that finding a solution to such a complex and long-standing complex is not easy. However, we strongly encourage meaningful dialogue and negotiations with the aim of reaching a comprehensive and just agreement that addresses the core issues which are at hand, which includes addressing concerns related to borders, settlements, security, Jerusalem, and the right to self-determination. Mr. President, we believe that it is crucial to recognize and respect the aspirations of the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. Mutual understanding, empathy, and compromise will surely build the essential trust in creating a conducive environment for peaceful coexistence. We therefore urge you to listen to one another's concerns and perspectives, and to engage in constructive dialogue that promotes understanding and reconciliation. We also call upon the international community to play an active role in these efforts. Mr. President, ending hostilities and achieving a just and lasting peace will require courage, will require leadership, and a genuine commitment to finding common ground. However bleak the prospects may be, we believe that with dedication, goodwill, and a shared vision for a better future, it is possible to achieve a peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. Let us therefore foster social cohesion, make available lifelong learning opportunities, promote reconciliation and healing, rebuild infrastructure, promote economic recovery, strengthen institutions and governance, engage civil society, and promote participation, and finally, invest in peace building and conflict prevention at the community and national levels. Mr. President, it is our prayer and hope that together we can build a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity by committing our resources and our cooperation from all our governments, international organizations, and the whole of our global community. Let us therefore seize upon, I say, this opportunity to break the cycle of violence and work towards a future that upholds the values of justice, equality, and the respect for human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Mr. President, I align myself with the statement delivered previously by the EU and would like to add the following in my national capacity. Let me start by recognizing the courageous work and sacrifice of UN employees in Gaza, and in particular those, including the 70 UNRWA staff, who had paid the ultimate price in the line of duty. I would also like to extend our sincere condolences to all Palestinians and Israelis who have suffered or lost loved ones. Mr. President, the gravity of the situation in the Middle East gives us great concern. This serious crisis presents a huge challenge and a test to all of us. In view of the above, Greece welcomes the attempts of the Security Council to address the situation in Israel and Gaza and regrets that these efforts so far have not been fruitful. We acknowledge that discussions are still ongoing and we hope that a conclusion will be reached. My country, right from the start, condemned in the strongest possible terms Hamas for its brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. Terrorism has no justification. Any form of violence, terrorism, or inhumane treatment is totally unacceptable. Israel has a right to its self-defense, to react and protect its citizens, always in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We call for the immediate release of all hostages without any precondition. Human lives cannot be reduced to a bargaining chip. At the same time, we are particularly alarmed by the catastrophic humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. All civilians must be protected at all times by all parties. To protect civilians and provide life-saving supplies, all necessary measures should be taken, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Our aim should be to protect as many lives as possible. In this regard, we are stepping up our assistance together with our partners to help those in need. Yet, we should all make sure that this conflict will not spill over and take far-reaching dimensions in the Middle East. We call on all states and international organizations to intensify urgent concrete steps to support efforts by the United Nations and regional states to prevent the violence in Gaza from expanding to other areas in the region. Greece's foreign policy is a principled one. We remain fully committed to a two-state solution in accordance with international law and relevant United Nations resolution. Only a political solution could create the long-term condition for peace, stability, and prosperity in the wider region. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritius.
Mr. President, it is now 6 days since the UNGA, acting under the Uniting for Peace initiative, adopted a resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Yet, the bombs are still exploding and civilians are still dying in huge numbers. Even before the resolution was adopted, Mauritius fully supported the Secretary General's call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Bloodshed of innocent civilians and destruction of basic infrastructure are unacceptable and will continue to fuel further violence. As we speak, the situation is worsening on the ground with no sign of abatement. We call on all parties to exercise the utmost restraint. According to latest reports, more than 10,000 civilians have fallen victims to the hostilities, whilst above 25,000 are suffering from injuries. 1.65 million people have been displaced already. It is revolting to note that women and children account for more than 62% of the fatalities. Moreover, 67 UN staff members working with the Palestinian Refugee Agency have been killed during airstrikes, with around 44 UNRWA installations being damaged. Yet again, a humanitarian crisis is unfolding in front of our very eyes. In the Gaza Strip, people have limited or no access to basic necessities, while food, drinking water, health services, safe shelter, and electricity are no longer existent. Latest reports indicate that the Gaza Strip is hardly able to sustain essential services. The international community needs to act now. Violence in Palestine must cease. The world cannot take the risk that violence spreads to other parts of Palestine and the neighboring countries. We welcome the safe passage of some aid convoys into the Gaza Strip for the supply of basic food, basic goods, essential medical equipment, and fuel so that health facilities can continue to operate. And we hope that adequate supply continues to flow in order to save as many lives as possible. Mauritius expresses its profound sympathies to the families of the victims as a result of the conflict both in Israel and the Gaza Strip. Mauritius strongly condemns violence in all its forms, including the terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, resulting in a number of hostages being taken. We welcome initiatives to find immediate solutions on various aspects of the conflict. The recent release of some hostages demonstrates that dialogue is only possible and is in fact the only way to find solution to the current situation. We appeal for the immediate release without conditions of all innocent civilians being held captive. Mauritius takes this opportunity to commend the efforts of all parties engaged in facilitating such release. Mr. President, Mauritius reiterates its unwavering support for a two-state solution based on relevant UN resolutions and on international law, which envisages the establishment of an independent, viable, and prosperous Palestinian state within secure and recognized borders, living in peace side by side with the State of Israel. We make a strong plea to both parties to urgently come to the negotiating table to revive peace talks in good faith. It is only through such talks that a peaceful and long-lasting solution can be found. Mauritius supports the holding of a series of international conferences under the auspices of the United Nations, involving all major actors, including Israel and Palestine, to agree to an immediate ceasefire and reopen the discussions with a view to finding a lasting solution. In this respect, we continue to encourage the Secretary General in his mediation efforts. At the same time, the full weight and scope of international humanitarian law must apply. Violence and terror only bring destruction and untold suffering. It is high time that a comprehensive solution is found to the conflict based on the principles of the United Nations Charter and on international law. Mr. President, we must all strive together to give peace a chance at a time when the world is already beset by a cascade of interlinked global crises. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mauritius, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho.
Mr. President, I take the floor. As I take the floor, allow me to join others in conveying our deepest condolences and words of sympathies to all families who have lost their loved ones in both Israel and Palestine as a result of this unprecedented conflict of our times. We also pay tribute to the United Nations humanitarian personnel who died in the line of duty while working selflessly to provide hope and support to the desperate civilians in Gaza. Our thoughts and prayers are with the injured. We continue to offer our solidarity to those who are working tirelessly in their mediation efforts in order to find lasting peace and stability in that region of the world, with the main objective of averting further loss of life of innocent civilians. It would be remiss of me not to commend the General Assembly for taking a principled and historical step last Friday by prioritizing the humanitarian situation of the people of Palestine through the adoption of the resolution that recognizes the centrality of preservation of lives of innocent civilians. However, my delegation remains mindful of the fact that adoption of the said resolution does not in any way whatsoever symbolize the end of the conflict in question. It only calls for further engagement by all and sundry to do our utmost to find a lasting diplomatic and political solution to this problem, which has acquired unprecedented proportions of our lifetime. Regrettably, the repeated failure of the UN Security Council to pass a definitive resolution on this conflict erodes confidence of the global citizenry on the functionality of this organization, thus amplifying the clarion call for its reform. We implore its members to take full responsibility and find an immediate solution to this war. Mr. President, my delegation is deeply concerned about the violation of human rights of people on both sides, some of which have been abducted, while others are being cut off from the essential basic needs. Unfortunately, most of them are women and children who are non-combatants. In this regard, we call for the immediate release of those kept in captivity. The world cannot continue to watch the horrifying pictures of children in Gaza being mercilessly killed on a daily basis from the Israeli bombardment. Under these circumstances, Lesotho appeals to all parties involved to exercise maximum restraint. Mr. President, further escalation of this conflict raises legitimate questions regarding its potentiality to spiral out of proportion. We are therefore all bound to call on the parties involved to give way to a diplomatic solution without any further delay. At the same time, we urge all parties to allow humanitarian corridors with guarantees of safety to humanitarian personnel. In conclusion, Chair, we express concern over any attempt to forcibly relocate the people of Gaza, contrary to the past UN resolutions, in which unequivocally recognize their inalienable right to self-determination. Our wish is that of a two-state solution wherein both Israelis and Palestinians will live side by side in peace with each other in line with the pre-adopted UN resolutions. History has proved beyond reasonable doubt that the cost of war is insurmountable in all its facets. As a result, during this critical time, the world must stand up steadfastly to recall the very foundations of the United Nations and live up to them. Finally, Chair, as John Donne puts it in his poem, no man is an island entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lesotho. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
Honorable Chair, at the outset, I would like to extend my thanks to you for resuming the 10th Emergency Special Session of the UN General Assembly to the backdrop of the painful and unfortunate developments that the Gaza Strip is witnessing and its dire humanitarian implications. Honorable Chair, the adoption by the General Assembly last week of a resolution that calls for an immediate and permanent and sustainable humanitarian
a pause that leads to a cessation of hostilities with a majority of 121 countries is a reflection of the world's demands for immediate measures to end the war. It is now time to respond to these calls and work tirelessly in order to achieve a permanent ceasefire in a manner that guarantees the safety and security of all parties. The Security Council has so far been unable to issue a resolution that puts an end to the consistent escalation that is causing untold suffering for the fraternal Palestinian people. Nevertheless, the Kingdom of Bahrain is calling upon the international community to uphold its humanitarian responsibilities in responding to the GA's resolution and to move immediately to preserve the lives and properties of people and the safety and security and stability of the region. We must also work to implement the legitimate international resolutions concerned with the Palestinian question and support the National Palestinian Authorities and the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the only legitimate representative of the fraternal Palestinian people. And under these cruel circumstances, the number one priority should be the protection of civilians on both sides of the conflict, and the international community should not hesitate to condemn any action that could lead to the loss of innocent lives, especially the murder of children and women. Such scenes of death and destruction can create entire generations filled with accumulated anger and thirst for vengeance, without solutions for any of our key causes. The Kingdom of Bahrain re-emphasizes the importance of consistent diplomatic efforts among all regional and international parties to de-escalate through an immediate ceasefire and an end to military operations, along with providing protection to innocent civilians on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides, and the release of all hostages and captives and detainees, in addition to refraining from any practices that could widen the circle of violence. We also emphasize the importance of lifting the siege off of the Gaza Strip and opening humanitarian passages and corridors and facilitating the flows of medical assistance and food and water and fuel and electricity unimpeded to the Gaza Strip. We must also put an end to the targeting of residential neighborhoods and health, educational and social facilities and houses of worship and infrastructure. And we must reject any attempts for forcibly displacing Palestinians from their lands in line with the international humanitarian law and the Fourth Geneva Convention for the year 1949. We value political and diplomatic efforts made on all levels in order to put an end to this destructive war. Therefore, we value the call made by His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, for an immediate ceasefire for humanitarian purposes. We value all his sincere endeavors to advance the role of the UN and to uphold its responsibilities and serve humanity. The Kingdom of Bahrain, led by His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, King of the Kingdom of Bahrain, may Allah keep and protect him, and along with the directives of the government led by His Highness Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, may Allah protect him, reasserts that the two-state solution is the only true guarantee for peaceful coexistence between the Palestinian and the Israeli people. There will be no stability in the Middle East without guaranteeing the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, especially a just, lasting, and sustainable peace in the region. We restate our steadfast position in support of the legitimate rights of the fraternal Palestinian people, chief among which is the right to establish their independent sovereign state with the borders of the 4th of June 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, as per the two-state solution and in line with the international law and the Arab Peace Initiative and the relevant resolutions issued by the Security Council and the UN General Assembly. In conclusion, Mr. President, continued escalation in the Gaza Strip will lead the region to a dangerous abyss and a new cycle of violence. The victims will be civilians and innocents. There will be more suffering and violations. Therefore, we need concerted efforts in order to contain this crisis and its catastrophic humanitarian implications, and we must work to establish a just, permanent, and lasting peace by including more peaceful negotiations and dialogue as per the rules of the international law for the peace and security and stability of all regions' peoples. Thank you.
Of Bahrain. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of El Salvador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I begin by expressing the deepest condolences of my country to all the victims of this resurgence of the conflict of long date. My country joins in those voices that have expressed deep-seated concern for the escalation of the violation and the grave unraveling of the situation in Israel, the Gaza Strip, the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, and the region. Without reservation, we condemn all acts of terrorism, regardless of the motivation and regardless of where it takes place, by whom, and when it is committed. We ask that these indiscriminate attacks stop and that all aggressions perpetrated against the civilian population cease. We also express our deep-seated concern for the disastrous humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the repercussions for the civilian population. We recall with heavy hearts that boys and girls are half of the population in Gaza, and they have lived their entire lives in a zone under constant conflict and siege. We express our support to the efforts of the Secretary General and for all of his calls in favor of immediate access and without impediments for humanitarian assistance to respond to the needs of the Palestinian civilian people in Gaza. However, we call for concrete measures to be taken to contribute effectively to a cessation of violence in the region and to put a stop to the suffering of the civilian population who are the most affected in this situation. We recognize the leadership efforts and fundamental role played by the group of Arab states to bring about a cessation of hostilities, to guarantee the protection of the civilian population, and to provide humanitarian assistance. Once again, we welcome the adoption of the resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Fulfillment of Legal and Humanitarian Obligations of Friday, 27 October. We believe that it was a concrete and tangible result yielded by this special emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly. Notwithstanding that, Mr. President, despite the adoption of the resolution at the same time that we met to resume the session, thousands of innocent people, including boys and girls, are losing their lives in Gaza, and many more are also losing their hopes that the violence stop, that the conflict come to an end, and that this organization take measures that would have an impact and put an end to their suffering. The meeting was convened after 6 days having elapsed, during which hundreds of people died in a horrific manner in the attack on the Al-Ali Arab hospital, many of whom were seeking refuge from the constant bombing in Gaza. Today, to date, more than 9,700 people have died, more than 21,000 have been wounded, and more than 1.4 million people have been displaced. These tragic numbers and events have done nothing more than increase with every hour that goes by, exacerbated by the events of recent days around the world. People have been following the development of this conflict with incredulity, frustration, and anguish. Many ask themselves, where is the United Nations? Where are the bodies that were created to protect the rights of thousands of people, especially those groups that are the most vulnerable? The people of the world are looking at this organization that was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and we must not fail them anymore. Rather than adopt resolutions that are legally binding with concrete mandates to put a stop to the fire, the Security Council has seen itself wrapped up in a vicious cycle of the presentation of resolutions and meetings and vetoes that do nothing more than undermine the little credibility that this body enjoyed before the resurgence of the conflict. Nothing, and I repeat, nothing justifies the inaction of the United Nations given the human suffering that we have witnessed in recent weeks. My country strenuously calls on the members of the Security Council, especially those who abuse their veto power, to fulfill their responsibilities, and that all members of the General Assembly have commended them under the United Nations Charter to maintain international peace and security. We urge that a stop be put to thinking under the shadow of individual particular interests, and that action be taken in keeping with the well-being of all humanity. This assembly has played its role, and its message was clear. The majority of states represented in this organization condemn all acts of violence aimed at Palestinian and Israeli civilians and ask for an immediate humanitarian truce, which is lasting and sustained, and that would lead to a cessation of hostilities. The Security Council then needs to listen to this call and take immediate action. Mr. President, my country is asking for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. No atrocity can justify another atrocity. We deplore and repudiate all attacks and aggressions against civilians and destruction that is widespread. We vigorously condemn the violence inflicted upon the civilian people, regardless of whom it's committed by and where. We ask for the immediate release of all civilians and demand their security, well-being, and humane treatment in keeping with international law. We have heard, we have recognized and made our own the clamor of the families that are asking for their loved ones to be able to go home. We ask all parties to immediately and fully comply with all the obligations incumbent upon them under international law, including international humanitarian law and the international law of human rights. Civilians, humanitarian personnel, and civilian humanitarian goods need to be unconditionally protected and at all times. We would underscore the impact and grave repercussions of armed conflicts, especially on women, boys and girls, and all civilians who are existing in a condition of vulnerability, such as people with disabilities or senior citizens. As put by the executive director of UNICEF just a couple of days ago, the real cost of the most recent escalation will be measured in the lives of girls and boys. Those losses due to the violence and those lives forever changed by the violence. We also ask that in fulfillment of international humanitarian law, all humanitarian and civilian facilities be respected and protected, including hospitals, medical facilities, transportation and equipment for medical care, schools, and places of religious faith and facilities of the United Nations. We unequivocally condemn all the aggressions and all attacks against the United Nations staff, humanitarian and personnel workers, and doctors, other medical staff, journalists, and the media. And we firmly defend their respect and protection. May I now take a moment to express our most sincere condolences and deep condolences to the families and members of UNRWA for the Palestinian refugees and all the humanitarian organizations that have suffered losses in this conflict. We pay tribute and we honor the memory of all the women and men who have lost their lives, protecting the rights and the dignity of the civilian population in the region. May I also express our deep admiration of UNRWA, which, despite the fact that is in a situation of chronic underfunding, it has spared no efforts to save the lives and safeguard the lives of the civilians in Gaza. We ask that the financial gap of the body be urgently addressed to provide humanitarian assistance, maintain basic services, and pay UNRWA staff. Mr. President, humanitarian access must immediately, fully, sustain, and safely be facilitated without any restrictions so that essential services and supplies can reach all the civilians in the Gaza Strip. This should not be limited just to water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity. We would underscore the imperative need under international humanitarian law to guarantee that the civilians not be deprived of what they need for their survival. We ask that to that end, immediately and effectively, humanitarian corridors be established with full protection and other initiatives be taken to facilitate the delivery of assistance to civilians. Mr. President, my country firmly rejects any forced attempt to move the civilian Palestinian population, and in this regard, we request a cancellation of the order that Palestinians, UN staff, humanitarian workers, or medical staff evacuate the zone north of the Gaza Strip. We reiterate that measures must be adopted that are adequate to guarantee the safety and well-being of civilians and their protection, especially girls and boys, and allow for their displacement in conditions of security. Mr. President, El Salvador joins the call of all parties that they act with a maximum amount of moderation. Today, that's more important than ever in order to prevent a further destabilization of the region and further escalation of violence in the region. We all have a responsibility in this regard. We ask the parties, especially those that have influence on the parties, to work urgently to that end. We highlight the need to guarantee accountability for the uncountable number of victims in this conflict. Investigations need to be undertaken that are independent and transparent under international norms and in keeping with them. It is necessary to put an end to impunity, guarantee justice, and prevent further violations. Mr. President, we recall here that a lasting solution to this conflict can only be achieved through peaceful means and with the will of the parties based on each and every resolution of the Security Council and of this General Assembly. We recall that the United Nations, under the resolutions adopted by this General Assembly, have an ongoing responsibility with regard to the Palestinian question until it is settled in all aspects. We recall that achieving a lasting, fair, and general settlement of this question is indispensable in order to bring about peace and stability in the Middle East. We urge the international community to redouble its efforts and coordinate efforts geared to restoring the political horizon and to promoting and expediting a fair, lasting, and peaceful solution to the conflict. What is required with urgency is a collective effort to begin talks on the peace process in the Middle East. Mr. President, El Salvador wishes for this special session of the General Assembly to be the beginning of a process that would lead to the so desired peace in the region. It is in our hands to return hope to people, the hope that they placed in this organization. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of El Salvador, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Panama.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Panama reiterates its vigorous condemnation of the terrorist attacks and the violence perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli civilians last October. According to international humanitarian law and conventions and the treaties of international law, deeply committed to the protection of and respect of human life, Panama emphatically regrets, the resurgence of violence that has led to the loss of lives of thousands of people in a series of violent events that have convulsed the region, such as the attack on the hospital in the north of Gaza, and which, moreover, led to the destruction of both civilian and humanitarian infrastructure that need to be protected by international law and by international humanitarian law by all parties. Given the grave situation in the Middle East, Panama calls for peace and the respect of human rights, with special attention for people who are most vulnerable in the Gaza Strip, life, health, and the well-being of the entire population, with emphasis on women, children, boys and girls, and teenagers, senior citizens, and persons with disabilities needs to be respected and protected. We also urge all parties involved to exercise restraint and to strictly respect the norms under international humanitarian law, both customary and by convention. This is essential to protect civilians and medical facilities in the areas of armed conflict. The escalation of violence only further deepens us into human suffering, increases the loss of lives without religious origin or ethnic distinction. Therefore, we also defend the idea of a humanitarian corridor that would allow the delivery without impediment in a continuous and safe manner of medical and humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. It's viable, it's possible, and it's urgent to do so. We also call for the urgent release without conditions of all of the civilians who have been abducted. In that regard, we recognize the efforts of the international actors who are dedicated to this task. The international community cannot tolerate the use of civilian hostages as a form of blackmail. Panama reaffirms its unbreakable commitment to peace, security, and stability in the Middle East and in the world. We should be an international community that demands the construction of a lasting peace, and we reiterate our firm commitment to multilateralism with the aspiration that it bring about an immediate cessation of violence and that international law be respected and that an effective path to peaceful settlement of the conflict be opened. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Panama, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, we are faced with a very serious crisis in the Middle East, and it is paramount to address the unfolding humanitarian situation, to save lives, and to facilitate solutions to avoid regional escalation. At the 10th General Assembly Emergency Special Session, we meet to defend the principles and norms of the UN Charter and to reaffirm that there is no justification for terrorism anywhere and anytime, nor for loss of lives of any kind. Romania condemns in the strongest possible terms the indiscriminate and atrocious terrorist attacks committed by Hamas across Israel, starting with October 7th, 2023. Each country has the right to defend itself and its citizens against terrorism, Israel included, in line with international law. We are profoundly shocked by the large amount of lost lives of Israeli and Palestinian alike, and our thoughts are with all the innocent victims of the conflict. Romania is one of the countries that mourns the loss of 5 dual nationals. All hostages held by Hamas must be immediately released. We acknowledge the work undertaken by international partners in releasing them. As one of the countries that has dual nationals held hostage, we hope the work in releasing them will continue. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. On the contrary, it acts against their aspirations by harming the Palestinian cause and the prospects of the two-state solution. My delegation reiterates the call to make a clear distinction between the justified and legitimate Palestinian expectations and demarches, which should be only addressed as part of a political process, and the terrorist attacks of Hamas, which are harming, in the end, Palestinian lives and the Palestinian future. Mr. President, at this stage of the conflict, it is important to reaffirm the respect of international law and the universal principles of international humanitarian law, particularly the Geneva Conventions. The protection of civilians, especially children, must be ensured at all times by all. While we welcome the humanitarian trucks that crossed Rafah last weekend and in the following days, we should be firm and united in upholding unhindered humanitarian assistance to Gaza. These measures are necessary, including humanitarian pauses, so as to allow the full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access consistent with international humanitarian law for United Nations humanitarian agencies and their implementing partners to act swiftly. All civilians should be protected at all times. As you know, the European Union and its member states will continue their efforts to assist EU citizens in the region. From a national point of view, this also includes their evacuation upon request. The conflict in Gaza not only destroys the future of Israelis and Palestinians, but it has also an immense potential to sparkle hate speech around the world. The rise of anti-Semitism, of anti-Palestinian or Islamophobic speech in the world is of great concern. It is the moment to act again and speak out against hatred. We are convinced that the most durable solutions to such complex situations are only those emerging and endorsed by all the legitimate parties involved. And therefore, Romania has abstained at the vote on the draft resolution. Mr. President, for too long, there is a lack of meaningful progress of the Middle East peace process. Many windows of opportunity have been lost, and in the end, civilians pay the price. However, we cannot give up peace. The two-state solution remains indispensable and the only option available for a lasting resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The two-state solution remains also indispensable for bringing just and lasting peace in the Middle East, based on international law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. The two-state solution will prevent the spillover of the conflict and stop other actors in fueling it. My delegation stands ready to engage for mediation efforts as part of the joint international responsibility to maintain peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Barbados.
Mr. President, Barbados associates itself with the statement delivered by Jamaica on behalf of the Caribbean community during this session, as well as with the CARICOM statement of 9 October 2023. Barbados condemns the heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated on Israel on October 7th, 2023, which caused over 1,000 to lose their lives and hundreds to be taken hostage, including women and children. Those responsible for these devastating violent acts must be brought to account. We express our alarm at the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and our deep concern for the safety and security of the people of Israel and Palestine. The conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza threatens to spill over to the entire Middle East, with catastrophic results for the people of that region, for global peace, and for the already fragile multilateral order. If this conflict continues unabated, it will also have devastating impacts on vulnerable populations everywhere. The international community of states and their peoples must therefore unite and prevent the situation from any further deterioration. The UN Security Council must act urgently and in unison. In this regard, Barbados welcomes the adoption on Friday, 27 October, by our Assembly of a resolution which called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. This was an important signal by the global community. Barbados voted in favor of that resolution because of its clear call for the protection of all civilians and the release of hostages, for the respect of international law, and for the need to find a lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of a two-state solution. Barbados also supported Canada's proposed amendment because it clearly identified those responsible for the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October on Israel. These points are all in accordance with Barbados's views on the situation as set out in our statement of 24 October. Mr. President, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, as called for by many and by the UN Secretary General, is now essential in order to ensure the protection of the lives and well-being of the innocent civilians of Israel and Gaza. Any aerial bombardment in Gaza, an area smaller than my own country, but with 7 times our population, is bound to have devastating effects on civilians. The death of thousands of Palestinians in these last weeks bears grim testimony to this. Barbados further calls for the immediate unconditional release of all hostages and the provision of humanitarian assistance in all its dimensions to the people of Gaza. I also wish to express Barbados's support and appreciation for the remarkable work and terrible sacrifices of the UN staff on the ground. We commend the Secretary General and his teams for their effort to provide relief and to find a path to peace. Since joining the United Nations upon our independence in 1966, Barbados has always supported a two-state solution, recognizing the rights of the people of both Israel and Palestine to their own state. The international community must now urgently agree and take action to ensure that the Palestinian people can exercise their right to self-determination in an independent, internationally recognized state in accordance with international law. A sustainable peace must be the world's singular focus, and it is only with dialogue that this can be achieved. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Barbados, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Federated States of Micronesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session of the General Assembly meets at a time of extremely difficult circumstances for civilians in both Israel and in Gaza. This august body, every one of us, must do its utmost to address and prevent this crisis, an already volatile situation, from spreading. Mr. President, now more than ever, it is important for this General Assembly to stand against the terror of Hamas and condemn unequivocally the abhorrent and despicable acts of October 7th against civilians and the State of Israel. Many of the victims were women, children, and the elderly. The heinous and brutal acts by Hamas and any other terrorist groups deserves this Assembly's condemnation and should never be tolerated. Terrorist attacks anywhere on anyone should not be condoned and are not justifiable. Neither is it justifiable for terrorists to use schools, hospitals, and innocent Palestinians as human shields. Micronesia stands with any state to defend itself from terrorist acts, and we support Israel's right to defend its territory and its people. It is not only a right under the Charter, the UN Charter, it is the obligation of any sovereign country. Mr. President, on behalf of my country, I express our heartfelt condolences to the families who lost loved ones. We call for the immediate unconditional release of the hostages held by Hamas and want both sides to respect international humanitarian law. We are grateful to those countries that are working tirelessly to save and protect civilian lives, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Any civilian's life lost is a tragedy. Mr. President, peace and security of the entire Middle East are under threat, and the risk of the crisis expanding within and beyond the region is very real. The international community and the United Nations must redouble efforts to bring back the peace process, a durable solution with two people, Israelis and Palestinians, two democratic states living side by side in peace, security, and dignity within mutually recognized borders is necessary for. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Federated States of Micronesia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea.
Mr. President, thank you for your stewardship of this emergency special session. Papua New Guinea is seriously concerned about the unfolding situation in Israel and Palestine following the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel on 7 October 2023. We offer our sincere condolences and sympathies to all victims of the conflict, both in Israel and Palestine, and to those UN staff who have tragically lost their lives in the line of selfless duty. Mr. President, my delegation condemns in the strongest possible terms the barbaric, depraved, and murderous Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist attack on Israel, and particularly against innocent civilians of Israel and other countries. Such heinous acts must never be condoned by anyone. This is why we also supported the Canadian draft amendment on Resolution A/ES 10/L.26, which in our view is important. The kidnapping and taking of hostages of Israeli and other countries' citizens, predominantly civilians, including children, the elderly, and women, by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, is also condemned in the strongest possible terms by my delegation. This is against international humanitarian law, and we call for the perpetrators to be held accountable. Papua New Guinea also joins other countries in calling for the urgent release of all hostages held by Hamas and without any preconditions. We welcome the release of those who have been released thus far and urge for the rest held against their will to be freed from abduction and captivity. All lives matter, and all measures are needed to protect civilians and their assets by the conflicting parties. We call on Hamas to not use civilians as human shield. Mr. President, acts of such heinous nature
perpetrated by Hamas and such other groups, including Hezbollah, must be designated by the Security Council as terrorist groups that deserve to be dealt with in a similar manner as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Mr. President, Papua New Guinea stands in solidarity with the State of Israel and unequivocally recognizes Israel's right to self-defense under international law. In the exercise of the right to self-defense, we also recognize the importance of proportionality and distinction as provided for under international humanitarian law. Papua New Guinea also strongly supports Israel's rightful existence as a nation and strongly condemns parties, including terrorists and terrorist organizations who are opposed to Israel's statehood. Mr. President, the evolving situation in Israel and Palestine has potential serious implications for peace and security and imperials, lives and livelihoods, not only for the parties to the conflict, but also for the wider Middle East region and beyond. The international community must work with all concerned parties in good faith and mutual respect to urgently de-escalate the situation and restore peace and security in the affected areas. We therefore join others in urging for an urgent humanitarian truce. This must also include the avoidance of the use of inflammatory rhetoric that is unhelpful to de-escalating the tense situation. In this spirit, we appreciate various international and regional efforts underway to de-escalate the situation between Israel and Palestine. Such efforts deserve the international community's support. We also appreciate the humanitarian efforts to provide for the needs of those who are affected by this conflict and extend to the frontline humanitarian workers our gratitude for their selfless service. We also call for the protection of all humanitarian workers and for the parties in the conflict to ensure their safety and security. Mr. President, this current conflict once again brings to the fore the critical importance and urgency for restarting efforts for the two-state solution. We encourage direct negotiations through peaceful means between all stakeholders in Israel and Palestine towards finding a mutually amicable and lasting political solution for Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peaceful coexistence. Finally, Mr. President, we are also concerned with the paralysis in the Security Council to appropriately consider all relevant issues in good faith and to urgently address the worsening situation as seen in the recent series of failed draft Security Council resolutions on this serious, increasing concern for peace and security and the well-being of all parties to the conflict. The Council must do better in the carriage of its mandate, a mandate that is representative of all humanity, not just merely representing that of a Council member's parochial interests alone. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea, and I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Tonga.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Kingdom of Tonga. Tonga condemns the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas against the State of Israel on the 7th of October 2023, which resulted in the slaughter of civilians. Tonga condemns further the kidnapping of civilians during that attack and who continue to be held captive as hostages. Tonga stands in solidarity with those who call for their immediate and unconditional release. Tonga supports Israel's inherent right of self-defense as assured by the Charter of the United Nations in its determined response to protect its citizens and bring stability to the volatile security situation. Mr. President, We acknowledge that this should not lessen the rights of Israelis and Palestinians to live in safety, in dignity, and in peace. Civilians, be they Israelis or Palestinians, are not a target and must be protected. Tonga supports further the desperate need for humanitarian aid to be delivered without restrictions or undue delay. In that regard, any respite in the military campaign in Gaza will be most helpful in order to facilitate delivery of such humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. Mr. President, as we continue our prayers for those who mourn the loss of loved ones, those who have survived, and those who are living now in uncertain fear and pain, the Kingdom of Tonga remains steadfast in its call for a peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tonga, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of San Marino.
Mr. President, Excellencies, San Marino joins the statement previously made by the European Union, and now I would like to make some remarks in my national capacity. The current crisis in the Middle East has brought profound suffering, pain, and destruction on both Israeli and Palestinian sides. This crisis demands a prompt and strong response by the international community. Our thoughts today are with all the innocent victims, Israelis, Palestinians, citizens from many other countries, as well as staff members of the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations. San Marino condemns the horrendous terror attacks launched by Hamas on 7 October 2023, the killing of innocent civilians, the holding of hostages, and the continued indiscriminate missile attacks on Israel. The perpetrators of these crime atrocities must be brought to justice. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages without preconditions. In this regard, we welcome all mediation actions carried out by various actors on the international scene with the aim of enabling the immediate release of people kidnapped in Israel. San Marino recognized the right of Israel to defend itself in line with international law and at the same time recognized the right of the Palestinian people to a free and independent state in accordance with UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. International humanitarian law must be respected at all times. The Palestinian population cannot be blamed for Hamas terrorist acts. The scale of the military operation and the forcible transfer of civilians within the territory, as well as the demolition in the West Bank, are a violation of international humanitarian law. It is essential to ensure at all times the protection of civilians and civilians' infrastructures, in particular medical facilities, schools, and UN premises, as well as to provide urgent humanitarian aid to promptly reach the Palestinian population who are stranded in the Gaza Strip in desperate conditions. Mr. President, it is crucial to avoid regional escalation, and we call on regional actors to refrain from any action that can further aggravate the situation. San Marino supports any initiative that may foster dialogue, promote an immediate ceasefire, and ultimately put an end to the ongoing conflict. We fully respect the right of the State of Israel and the legitimate aspiration and rights of the Palestinian people, and we remain committed to a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution. Finally, Mr. President, with reference to the resolution previously adopted, we regret that the amendment proposed by Canada was not adopted. In our point of view, it would have helped the resolution, making it more representative for many countries and finally more inclusive with respect of the position expressed in this venerable assembly. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of San Marino, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly on illegal Israeli actions in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory comes at a very challenging time and under painful humanitarian circumstances. This debate is of great importance due to its implications for peace and security in the Middle East, a region of great political and diplomatic sensitivity, and which at this moment represents yet another test for multilateralism as mechanism to resolving the intricate international challenges we face today. Angola is deeply concerned about the exponential increase of violence in the Middle East since the 7 October attack, which every day worsens human suffering and takes the lives of innocent civilians, including women and children. We condemn terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, regardless of their motivations or actors. Likewise, we are also alarmed by the likelihood of the Gaza crisis spilling over and turning into a regional conflict with dangerous implications for international peace and stability. The international community must mitigate such risks by urging all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate, and respect the norms of international law. The only viable way to achieve durable peace is through dialogue and peaceful settlement of disputes. In this context, we support the UN General Assembly resolution that, among other key messages, calls for an immediate, durable, and sustainable humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities and the immediate and unconditional release of all civilian hostages, as well as demands the immediate, continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians through the Gaza Strip under the international humanitarian law, and reaffirms that a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be achieved by peaceful means based on the relevant United Nations resolutions and in accordance with international law and on the basis of the two-state solution. We commend the humanitarian work being done by the UN personnel under very difficult and challenging conditions to save lives, which is an expression of their unwavering commitment to the values of human dignity and international solidarity. We mourn those who died victims of this conflict and express our heartfelt condolences to the bereaved families in Israel, the Gaza Strip, and beyond. Excellencies, Angola recognized the pertinent role of the United Nations in seeking universal solutions based on its Charter's major principles of international relations, namely, sovereign equality of all its members, obligation of all the members to settle their dispute by peaceful and amicable means in such a manner as to not endanger or jeopardize the international peace, security, and justice, and fulfill in good faith the obligation assumed by them in accordance with the Charter. Tolerance and peaceful coexistence among nations. The current challenges of peace and security in the Middle East demonstrate the urgency of prioritizing the search for a fair and sustainable solution based on the application of the relevant United Nations resolutions and international law with the aim of achieving the two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security within international recognized borders. The United Nations remains the best hope and the last frontier for peacemaking and peacekeeping to prevent conflicts and settle international disputes. However, today's global challenges reinforce Angola's conviction about the urgent need to reform the United Nations system, especially its Security Council, to make it effective, representative, and inclusive, and able to strengthen multilateralism as the way of dealing with common and interconnected threats and preserving all the peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Angola. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Mr. President, Finland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We have condemned the cowardly terrorist attack by Hamas against civilians in Israel in the strongest terms. Now, in only 3 weeks, over 10,000 people in Israel and the Palestinian territory have lost their lives in the attack and the escalation that has followed. We are deeply saddened by all this human suffering. Civilians, including women, children, the elderly, have once again paid the highest price. We stress that international humanitarian law must always be respected by all parties to a conflict, and all civilians must be protected in all situations. Security belongs to all. Finland recognizes the right of Israel to protect its civilian population, but we strongly underline that military operations must be proportionate and in line with international humanitarian law. All possible measures to spare civilian lives must be taken in all situations. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages held in Gaza and commend the role that the UN, Egypt, Qatar, and other countries in the region have once again played. We supported the Canadian amendment to the resolution presented on Friday. The amendment would have been important and truthful in clearly mentioning the responsibility of Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. Because the amendment was not adopted, we unfortunately had to abstain on the resolution, despite agreeing with most of its highly relevant and carefully formulated content. We thank the Arab Group for all their work in building consensus on this extremely important and urgent issue. We urge the Security Council to assume its responsibility under the Charter and adopt a resolution as soon as possible. The already catastrophic situation is deteriorating as we speak. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is indeed catastrophic. International humanitarian law protects objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as food, water, medical supplies, shelter, as well as electricity and fuel. The civilian population of Gaza, including the children and women, of whom 50,000 are estimated to be pregnant, is in desperate need of all this. We call for continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. All necessary means, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs, must be employed to facilitate the delivery of more aid with utmost urgency. Our great appreciation goes to the UN and other humanitarian actors and their staff for their crucial work, often at the risk of their own lives. Efforts to discredit the UN and the other humanitarian personnel are unacceptable. A joint international effort to de-escalate and to prevent further escalation is needed. The developments in the West Bank are going in the opposite direction. Israel has the legal obligation to protect civilians also from the violence of Israeli citizens residing in the settlements, which are all illegal under international law. We greatly appreciate the diplomatic role that the Secretary General Guterres, the countries in the region, as well as the United States have played on the ground. We commend Egypt for the important initiative to host the Peace Summit. All diplomatic efforts are of great value. We highlight the constructive role and commitment to non-violence of the Palestinian Authority. The role that the Palestinian Authority has played and continues to play as the partner for the entire international community should be commended and respected. The situation again highlights that the only sustainable way to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a negotiated two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. The solution must meet Israeli and Palestinian security needs and Palestinian aspirations for statehood and sovereignty, end the occupation that began in 1967, and resolve all permanent status issues. Gaza and the West Bank must be considered as one entity in order to create a viable Palestinian state. We, as the international community, must bear our responsibility by making the strongest possible push for negotiations as soon as it becomes possible. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Finland. And now we have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers tomorrow at 3 p.m. in this hall. The details of the program will be announced in the Journal of the United Nations. The meeting is adjourned.
Population by all involved parties. The path to a win-win situation lies in embracing peace, as war only brings destruction and suffering. South Sudan remain optimistic about the future of the world. We have come a long way since our struggle for independence, overcoming numerous challenges and gaining valuable experiences. With the continued international coordination, we are confident that we can realize our vision of a peaceful, prosperous, and progressive world. Our historical struggle for self-determination stands as a testament to the power of dialogue, understanding, and cooperation in shaping a better world. We are committed to contributing to the global efforts to address challenges facing our human family. We pledge our dedication to multilateralism and international cooperation as the most effective means to achieve our shared aspirations. We are eager to actively engage in this assembly and other forums to exchange insights, experience, and the best practices with fellow members states. Together, we can rebuild trust and rekindle global solidarity, ensuring a brighter future for current and future generations. In these trying times, when the world faces terrorist, unprovoked attacks and crisis, it falls upon those unafraid to condemn it to pave the way that leads to peace. President Salva Kiir Mayardit extends his condolences to the lost innocence of children, women, and population. His Excellency condemned this heinous, unprovoked terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas, emphasizing that no political grievances can ever justify the killing of innocent civilians. Mr. President, this message conveys South Sudan's solidarity with the innocents in the face of conflict. It resolutes condemnation of violence targeting civil society and people. South Sudan stands firmly with the international community in denouncing all forms of terrorism and violence against civilians. South Sudan stands for peace, and South Sudan is calling for peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Sudan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and we welcome the convening of this emergency special session of the General Assembly. While we have been debating in this forum over the past few days, a major crisis has been unfolding in the Middle East. We mourn the loss of life and suffering of so many innocent civilians, including UN personnel who perished in the line of duty. This situation did not evolve in a vacuum. The terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas on 7th October, which we unequivocally condemn, cannot be justified by any means. Faced with this heinous act, Israel has the right to self-defense in line with international law, including international humanitarian law.
We echo the calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, while at the same time underscoring that Hamas does not represent the Palestinians. Cyprus reiterates the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times, in line with international humanitarian law, and deplores all loss of civilian life. It is imperative that the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza be addressed by allowing for the constant, unhindered, and safe delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. Cyprus supports UN and regional efforts to ensure the sustained flow of humanitarian aid to those in need, increasing humanitarian assistance for Palestinians while ensuring that such assistance is not abused by terrorist organizations is a priority for Cyprus and the EU as a whole. As this grave situation is rapidly evolving, the urgent need for de-escalation cannot be emphasized enough. A spillover to neighboring countries would be disastrous and right now does not appear unlikely. This is a crisis with potential catastrophic consequences, not least because the conflict also poses a serious national security threat, particularly for countries of the region, that should not be underestimated, including due to potential increase of refugee flows. The UN Charter remains the cornerstone of international law and the pursuit of international peace and security. Respect for the UN Charter and international law should be a guiding principle for all parties, in particular where this concerns the protection of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and medical facilities, including UN premises and their personnel. Mr. President, our region cannot shoulder further instability, and the current crisis has amplified the need for reinstating a political process on the horizon. There is no other option than to create the necessary conditions and fully recommit to a viable two-state solution in line with the parameters reflected in the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. A comprehensive, lasting solution to the conflict is now critical in order to avoid repeated cycles of violence. As a country in the region, Cyprus has been offering a safe platform for evacuations via sea and air. Due to our geographical proximity, we have been in consultations and coordination with our regional partners to practically facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance to address the dire humanitarian needs in the Gaza Strip. These efforts include the establishment of a maritime humanitarian corridor from Cyprus as a mid- and long-term necessity, which would contribute to alleviate the constantly increasing assistance necessities and serve to decompress other corridors with full consideration of the security aspect, as well as the need to secure the sustained, regulated, and robust flow of humanitarian aid. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus, and I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Denmark aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Since October 7th, the world has witnessed a horrifying escalation of the situation in the Middle East. This outbreak of violence has already caused immense human suffering, and regrettably, the crisis is deteriorating by the day. We mourn the thousands of innocent civilians already killed or wounded in this terrible conflict, and extend our most heartfelt sympathy and condolences to their families and loved ones. Denmark condemns in the strongest possible terms Hamas and its brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. We reiterate that there can be no justification for terror, and we strongly emphasize Israel's right to defend itself in line with humanitarian and international law in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks. We also call on Hamas to immediately release all hostages without any precondition. We are witnessing a heartbreaking level of civilian suffering. Denmark reiterates the importance of ensuring the protections of all civilians at all times in line with international humanitarian law. This includes taking all feasible precautions to prevent civilian casualties and reduce damage. We also underline the importance of protecting medical facilities, schools, and UN premises at all times. Mr. President, Denmark is gravely concerned at the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Together with the EU, we continue our call for continued, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access throughout Gaza, including through humanitarian corridors and pauses. It is paramount to ensure an urgent increase in the provisions of humanitarian aid to the civilian population of Gaza, so desperately in need of food, water, shelter, electricity, fuel, and medical care. We welcome that some trucks with humanitarian aid have entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing, but reiterate that much more is needed. Denmark is a long-term donor to UNRWA and among top 15 donors. To respond to the current situation, the Danish government has increased Denmark's humanitarian aid for Gaza and the West Bank with an extraordinary pledge of approximately $7 million. Denmark is grateful to the UN Secretary General for his tireless efforts to ensure the urgent delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance to the civilian population of Gaza. We commend the humanitarian personnel working day and night in Gaza to facilitate the urgent delivery of humanitarian assistance, but deeply regret that this heroic work has cost more than 70 UN personnel their lives. We express our deepest condolences to their families and reiterate that humanitarian workers and UN personnel must be protected at all times. Mr. President, as member states to the United Nations, we all have an obligation to work constructively to find solutions to this immense crisis. In particular, we have entrusted the Security Council with the primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Rarely should the weight of this responsibility be felt heavier than today. For this reason, we urge the Security Council, and particularly its permanent members, to redouble their efforts towards finding a common position that can address the current escalation of violence. In this regard, we recommend the constructive role played by the elected members of the Security Council. While we are deeply concerned about the situation in Gaza, it is also crucial to prevent regional escalation, and we call on all regional actors to refrain from any action that can further aggravate the situation. We also note with great concern the significant increase in violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. We stress that the importance of engaging broadly with the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian Authority, as well as regional and international partners, to prevent further escalation. In this tragic situation, we are reminded once again of the need for a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution. For this reason, we remain committed to reinvigorating the efforts in the Middle East peace process. In the midst of the present crisis, we must never lose sight of this viable path to a durable peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of the Marshall Islands stands in deep concern of the escalating security and humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We join many others in deploring the gruesome and terrorist acts of Hamas, and we urge the safe treatment and immediate release of hostages. The Marshall Islands supports the ongoing engagement and diplomatic dialogue within the wider Middle East region. And we stand in support of recognizing Israel's right to self-defense, the general same duty to security which every country in this room owes it to its own people. In addressing Israel's security against terrorist act is important, and with no less urgency, the wider response to the humanitarian crisis is clearly needs to be upscaled. War is difficult and horrible, tragic, as all wars are. Nobody wins. The international community has learned lessons from the distant and recent past, or we all certainly should have learned those lessons. But those lessons are not always simple issues, and the current crisis is highly complex and layered. The Marshall Islands supports international effort to urgently address the growing and difficult humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and to ensure supplies are safely monitored and delivered to vulnerable civilian populations. The people of Gaza are not the same as Hamas, and addressing militant terrorists who are embedded in civilian infrastructure is complex. Hamas has not been elected since 2006. Appropriate and responsive in humanitarian measures and specific, narrowly targeted, and time-bound pauses are needed to ensure further and faster delivery of humanitarian aid. But this cannot be at the expense of the worsening security threats or allowing Hamas to rearm itself, which only extends the cycle of violence and conflict. Arm to civilian, any civilian, regardless of nationality, should and must be minimized. This is true of any conflict. We can do better as a General Assembly, even as there are difficult issues on which we all struggle to find common words. The Marshall Islands stands with the majority of voting members who voted to condemn Hamas by voting for the Canadian amendment, or did not move to block it, even if that did not meet the procedural two-thirds threshold. Yes, this war has a typical context and a clear history before it. But if the General Assembly cannot even state or directly acknowledge what happened, then we are all doing something wrong. If we cannot call for the release of hostages, then we are doing something wrong. And if we cannot address the humanitarian and security dimension, then we are still doing something wrong. Hamas' barbaric attacks on Israel happened, and those were indiscriminate and specifically targeted at civilians, limbs and heads ripped from bodies. That can be a call for revenge, but instead, this should serve to underscore the gravity of the threat posed by Hamas. And we are equally clear-eyed and concerned about the devastating humanitarian crisis within Gaza and the wider regional impact of this war. And as I speak, this remains an active hostage situation involving people from 40 nations. It is important that accountability is upheld and that there remains wider multilateral engagement, even or especially when there is disagreement. Objectivity cannot be cast aside, and playing field is level, not predetermined, and addresses all evidence, facts, and actors. For the Marshall Islands, we are now understanding the implication of multi-theater conflict and tension around the world. Throughout each, we can start to understand the common thread of security, of humanity, and dignity. It is imperative that this august body finds better means of working across divides and building common action. That task will be hard, but it is not impossible to capture the common concern with the diversity of views. As the UN General Assembly, we must keep working together to find an appropriate way to specifically express what has happened and the need from all populations for their security, safety, essential rights, and well-being. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Marshall Islands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Andorra.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We're grateful for this special emergency session. Andorra subscribes to the statement made by the European Union, and I have the honor of making the following comments in my national capacity. In the face of one of the most complex crises of the region, we would like to state first and foremost our strongest condemnation of the terrible terrorist attacks committed by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October. We express also our compassion for all the victims of the conflict and would like to make an urgent appeal for the release of all hostages. We also regret that over 70 members of the United Nations agencies have lost their lives while fulfilling their duty by providing assistance to the civilian population. We would like to express our solidarity and condolences to the families of the victims. Mr. President, Andorra urges the upholding of international law for the protection of the civilian population and attaches the greatest possible importance to the humanitarian action, which is urgent in this case. Establishing a humanitarian truce, as reflected in the resolution, will offer opportunities to provide resources and to care for people living in Gaza and the high number of IDPs. We're grateful for the efforts to achieve this, and we're encouraged that there has been humanitarian deliveries that have increased, although clearly insufficiently. Mr. President, this conflict has had a horrific number of victims, mostly women and children. This is a great source of concern for us. Added to that is the fact that this conflict has severely altered access to basic services that we have always championed in this organization. Furthermore, the right to health and the right to education can no longer be enjoyed. The cost of this in the future will be very high. The impact has been devastating and traumatic for entire families and communities. There is no way that the only alternative is to offer hope, to find peace. Children everywhere in every side of the conflict live in the present, but they must be able to learn to project into the future and to project into the future from a place of peace. Mr. President, we acknowledge the actions and activities of the United Nations, of the Secretary General, and of its agencies in this critical moment. Andorra calls for an immediate ceasefire and the deployment of all necessary diplomatic efforts to protect the civilian population in all zones affected by the conflict and to facilitate access to humanitarian aid in conformity with international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Andorra. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Palau.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, colleagues, we convene here at a fragile and precarious time in the world. Since the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas, an attack that triggered a traumatic and heavy response from Israel, we're now seeing devastating, heartbreaking events tragically unfold in the Gaza Strip. Palau unequivocally condemns the terrorist attacks on Israel and expresses our deepest condolences to Israel and the families of those who lost their lives or were injured, and call for the immediate release of hostages. The brutal fighting between Israel and Hamas that ensued has already taken the lives of thousands of civilians in the Gaza Strip, over 8,000 people and mounting, and inflicted wrenching misery on both sides. We similarly extend our sincere condolences to the families of the victims in Gaza and for the loss of UN staff and personnel. Mr. President, it would be remiss of us not to mention that Hamas intentionally puts the Palestinian people in harm's way by storing weapons and command posts under civilian hospitals, schools, mosques, and buildings. The suffering of the citizens of Gaza isn't incidental to Hamas, it's essential.
It's part and parcel of their propaganda. Hamas has repeatedly declared opposition to a two-state solution and to any negotiations, with their stated goal to annihilate Israel completely. So how does one negotiate with an entity that wants to annihilate Jews from the face of the earth? Using the old tropes of Jewish occupation as a root cause of Hamas's barbarism doesn't in any way justify Hamas's murderous actions, nor its continued use of unguided missiles sent into Israel. Invading civilian homes, terrorizing civilians, murdering young people at a concert, kidnapping babies, torturing them in a well-orchestrated attack that was probably meant to do exactly what it's doing now. Hamas is content to sacrifice the Palestinian people as they try to turn the world against Israel. It is for this reason that Palau voted to support the Canadian amendment to condemn Hamas. Colleagues, we can condemn the terrorist actions of Hamas and call for a humanitarian response and restraint from Israel in Gaza. These are not mutually exclusive events, but because of the deep wounds of this region, it's often posed as an either-or, a proposition that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But this leads to a downward spiral of hatred and extremism and perpetuates conflict and despair. Because this amendment to condemn Hamas failed and the resolution lacked language calling for the release of hostages, Palau abstained on the resolution. However, Mr. President, while we maintain that Israel has the right, if not the obligation, to defend itself, it should do so in accordance with regard for the safety of innocent civilians and in accordance with international law. Food, water, medicine, and other essential humanitarian assistance must be able to flow into Gaza and to the people who need them. We commend efforts by many member states and UN agencies who've stepped up to help in the past few weeks. While dozens of trucks have passed through the Rafah crossing, hundreds more must follow to meet the dire needs of over 2 million people. Palau also joins calls by others for humanitarian pauses in order to get more people out of Gaza and out of harm's way. We are all too familiar with the atrocities of war, Mr. President, but war has its rules, rules that we all agreed to as members of this esteemed body, and in the midst of fighting, we must not forget our humanity. We urge for restraint to allow for certain events to happen that will remind us of this humanity, so that innocent people, including children, may be relocated to safer areas, so that hungry, thirsty, shell-shocked people can get some relief, so that injured civilians may get treatment, so that both sides may mourn and bury their dead. Palau calls on all parties to remember the sanctity of innocent human life. So many of those who've been killed are women and children, innocent children who've grown up in an already challenging environment. Many of those killed didn't have any recourse or anywhere to go. We should not forget that a Palestinian mother will mourn her child the same way an Israeli mother does, and vice versa. In looking ahead, as the Middle East rebuilds from this conflict, as it has done many times before, we urge for the resumption of talks for a two-state solution. Our concern is that if the status quo continues, it may ultimately result in a situation where Israel may win the battle but lose the peace. It will result in yet another generation of retribution, extremism, and hatred, perpetuating this ongoing conflict that has plagued the Middle East for far too long. Our international community must redouble efforts to bring back the peace process. A durable solution with two people, Israelis and Palestinians, two democratic states, living side by side in peace, security, and dignity within mutually recognized borders is necessary for a lasting peace. The distinguished delegate from the UK said it well. We call for love over hate, light over darkness. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Israel and with the people of Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Palau. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
President, for the sake of children, Palestinian children and Israeli children, the world must do better. Diplomacy must do better.
Save the Children on Sunday reported that nearly 3,200 children were killed in Gaza in just 3 weeks. 1,000 more are missing, presumed dead. On the Israeli side, at least 30 children have been killed. Every child's death is one too many. Children bear no responsibility for the situation and must be protected. We grieve with the Israeli and Palestinian parents and can only imagine the desperation and sorrow caused by the loss of their loved ones. People on both sides deserve to live in peace and security. And 2 issues need to be crystal clear. 1, all parties must act in accordance with international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of civilians caught in the midst of the hostilities. Even wars have rules. 2, all lives are equal and there is no hierarchy between them. This is essential not only for the protection of civilians today, but for the future for both Israelis and Palestinians. How people are treated during the conflict can determine the prospects for a political solution that can lead to a durable peace. President, we meet at an extremely critical time for Israelis and Palestinians, for the Middle East, and for the world. Norway has strongly condemned Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks on 7 October, killing about 1,400 people and taking more than 200 hostages. We demand that Hamas and other actors in the Gaza Strip release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Israel has a right to defend itself against the armed attacks by Hamas. However, we emphasize that the self-defense measures taken must be necessary and proportionate. Furthermore, all military operations must be conducted in line with international humanitarian law. All parties to armed conflicts have an obligation to protect civilians and civilian objects, including hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure. The scale of the civilian suffering, both physically and mentally, inflicted by the combination of intense Israeli bombardments and a blockade is heartbreaking and unacceptable. President, on the basis of this humanitarian catastrophe, we find it difficult to draw any other conclusion than that the parties to this conflict are not doing enough to comply with their obligations to protect the civilians affected by the ongoing hostilities. We call on all actors to strictly adhere to the international humanitarian law principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. We also call on the parties to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance and essential services for all civilians in the Gaza Strip. All parties to the conflict must make sure that the civilian population can uphold the bare necessities of life, even in the midst of war. Opening the Karem Shalom border crossing would also improve humanitarian access while safeguarding Israel's legitimate security concerns. On the Egyptian side, we encourage accepting the offer of international humanitarian staff to complement and boost the impressive work of the Egyptian Red Crescent. We commend the courage and resilience of Palestinian health and humanitarian workers and volunteers for their heroic efforts to save lives while risking their own. We mourn with the families of those who tragically lost their lives in the pursuit for humanity, peace, and a better world for others. We must honor their memory by giving it our best. Diplomacy must do better. President, we are deeply concerned about the increase in violence in the West Bank, including from Israeli settlers. The consequences of a further escalation of violence and potential destabilization in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as in the broader Middle East region, would be devastating. We call on all actors in the region to contribute to de-escalation to prevent a wider regional conflict. President, the UN's role is indispensable in this crisis. The UN family on the ground is making tremendous efforts to deliver on the humanitarian needs of the Gaza population under impossible circumstances. UNRWA, despite years of underfinancing, is making an absolutely crucial contribution. We encourage all member states to respond to appeals for additional financial support to ensure that the UN can maintain and scale up its response. We regret that the Security Council's inability to come together to recommend actions to de-escalate and alleviate the grave humanitarian situation. The veto should never prevent the UN from fulfilling its mandate. It is therefore vital that the General Assembly has taken up its responsibility, adopting a resolution calling for a durable and sustained humanitarian truce, leading to a cessation of hostilities. Norway voted in favor of this resolution in light of the gravity of the situation on the ground, in particular regarding the humanitarian catastrophe we see evolving in Gaza. The violence must stop. We hope the Council will take up its responsibility. President, on the 25th of October, as chair of the AHLC, Norway hosted an informal meeting among partners in the International Donor Group for Palestine. There was broad agreement among participants about the urgency of providing humanitarian assistance and ensuring access to Gaza. The need to continue our support to the Palestinian Authority, its institutions and service delivery to the Palestinian people was another clear call from the meeting. There is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The solution can only be political. There must be a credible political path. The only viable solution to achieve lasting peace, security, and self-determination for both peoples is a negotiated two-state solution. Even in the middle of a war, there is a need to discuss ways to build a credible path towards peace. The children in Palestine and Israel are paying the highest price. They are being traumatized for life by this war. These children will one day be the leaders that we all depend on for a peaceful Middle East. President, I reiterate one last message. Diplomacy must do better. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway. I now give the floor to the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the Sovereign Order of Malta is grateful for the opportunity to speak before you today as a neutral and non-partisan witness to the pain and suffering that is bedeviling the land in which we were founded 900 years ago, and which is the place of the origin of our faith. As both a faith-based international entity and a Catholic Hospitaller order, our mission is to serve all of humanity through the provision of healthcare and related services. Our love of the Holy Land, sacred to us as it is to Jews and to Muslims, has been severely tested by the calculated violence that has recently been unleashed on so many people. So many lives lost, so many people suffering, so many children and mothers in pain. A report issued today by the Palestinian Permanent Observer reports that 19 hospitals and 49 health clinics have been hit by incoming fire, while the main hospital for cancer patients was seriously damaged on the 30th of October and is no longer functioning. The main generator at the Indonesian hospital in Gaza has now run out of fuel. And as a surgeon at El Shahifa Hospital warned, basically without electricity, this hospital becomes a mass grave. Our ambassador to Palestine informs us that in the West Bank, the Holy Family Hospital in Bethlehem, operated by the Order of Malta, has made every provision necessary to accommodate victims and those in need of medical assistance. However, due to blockades and border crossings being closed, hospitals across the West Bank, including ours, are unable to replenish their stocks of life-saving medical supplies and equipment. Patients are fearful of traveling to seek help, and doctors are prevented from operating the mobile clinics which used to bring such help and support to so many. More suffering, more anger, more death. Mr. President, consider the plight of pregnant women in Gaza. Estimates are that there are up to 50,000, with 5,000 plus deliveries anticipated each month. The destruction of healthcare facilities and the lack of suitable medical and supplies puts the lives of these mothers and their infants as yet unborn in jeopardy. The overcrowding of shelters and the damage to water and sanitation infrastructure in Gaza is contributing to a public health disaster that is already manifest. Whichever faction was responsible for, or whoever's missiles landed in the grounds of Al-Ahli Hospital, one thing is clear. It is the innocent, particularly women and children, who ultimately bear the heaviest burden. Al-Ahli Hospital is symbolic of what this once holy land has now become, a self-fulfilling prophecy of death, destruction, and hatred. Mr. President, this chamber has been debating Palestine for many, many decades. Some of the best and most astute brains in the world have, however, failed to achieve much more than piecemeal and half-won compromise. Yes, amid it all, a lot of real promise, but promise that has not been realized. Perhaps at this moment of international crisis, we can all put self-interest and global alliances aside and implore this assembly to forge a peaceful settlement that will result in bringing more than a safe corridor or 20 trucks a day bringing critical aid to 2 million people, or the measured release of innocent, unjustly imprisoned hostages, all of which is necessary, all of which is needed, but which simply does not match the scale of what is happening in the lives and in the hearts and souls of millions of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish families. We urge this United Nations to live up to its charter for the sake of the children of Palestine and Israel, the ones that will survive this conflict. Do not let history repeat itself by once more doing too little, too late. Future generations may not be able to hold us to account, but Almighty God will. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta. I now give the floor to the observer of the African Union.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the African Union Commission, I want to express our sincere thanks and gratitude to you, Mr. President, for convening this timely and important 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly.
We thank the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the Islamic Republic of Mauritania in their capacities as chair of the African Group and organization of the Islamic Cooperation Group, respectively, for requesting the session. Mr. President, we are meeting today at a very difficult time. For the African Union Commission, the situation in Gaza and the occupied territories remains a deep matter of concern. As we sit in this hall, the bombardment and hostilities are still going on right now. The Israeli airstrikes in the last few weeks and the recent major ground offensive in Gaza have claimed thousands of lives, including those of thousands of children. This has created a dire humanitarian situation which has dramatically deteriorated an already fragile situation. We condemn the escalating violence and loss of civilian and innocent lives, including those of UN staff and humanitarian workers. All human life, no matter race or creed, is sacred and must be protected, and fundamental rights and dignity for all must be upheld. We join others in extending our condolences to all those affected by this crisis, and also join in calling for an immediate ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, while also urging all the parties to engage in a meaningful dialogue to de-escalate tension. We also join the call for the release of prisoners and hostages. The cycle of violence and suffering has to end, and a durable solution must be found through a just and comprehensive peace process that respects the aspirations and rights of both Palestinians and Israelis. We reaffirm our support to and the confidence in the SD's leadership, the Secretary General's leadership, and join in supporting his call for the provision of much-needed medical equipment, food, fuel, and other humanitarian supplies desperately needed, as well as access for humanitarian personnel. Mr. President, the African Union's support to the Palestinian cause is very profound for us. It is premised on the values of freedom, justice, and humanitarian principles that Africa defends in the international fora, alongside all those striving to ensure that Palestine regains its right to exist as a key viable state. Africa has consistently expressed deep concerns at the consequences of impunity, unilateral policies, provocations, and non-adherence to international law. We therefore call upon the government of Israel to ensure that it upholds its obligations under international human rights law and the international humanitarian law. The international community must also shoulder its responsibilities by providing protection to civilians and access to humanitarian assistance. We all have a vested interest in promoting a just and peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. President, we have regrettably witnessed over the last few weeks the inability of the Security Council to act and adequately deliver on this issue, while the situation was deteriorating at an unprecedented scale. We therefore welcome the adoption of the General Assembly humanitarian resolution last week, which called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce and a cessation of hostilities.